Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by Carium, the telehealth platform enabling healthcare's digital transformation, helping you care for people within the fabric of their daily lives. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Dr. CK Wang, Chief Medical Officer at COTA. CK, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So what I always like to do at the beginning of each show is let my guests have a chance to give more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So CK, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Be very happy to. So I am a trained medical oncologist and started my career in private practice, actually. I'm based in the North Texas area, and I was in practice for about 12 years before making the leap outside of medicine. And it was a difficult decision at that time, and this would have been nearly 5 years ago now. And after I left full-time practice, I transitioned to IBM Watson Health and was with IBM for approximately 2 years before coming to COTA. I came into COTA as a senior medical director and became the chief medical officer a little bit over 2 years ago. And today here at COTA, I essentially oversee all the medical and research functions of the company. I oversee a relatively large team comprised mostly of, we have medical oncologists, we have nurses, we have biostatisticians, so in a very focused medical and scientific task, so to speak, here at COTA.
So I'm kind of interested in two things about your career path. The first one is, what made you interested in gave you the drive to become a physician?
Matt, that's an excellent question. I will say that ever since I could remember, I've always been interested in being in the medical world, fascinated by what doctors did. And that focus remained and stayed with me throughout my entire, upbringing, throughout my schooling and education. And I guess it helped the fact that I was good in the sciences. And when it came time to in college, right, trying to figure out what path I wanted to take, it was a logical choice to explore medicine. So I would say that this is something that I've always had in my mind almost all my life.
So kind of starting from that point, then, as you said, I think you said about 5 years ago, you transitioned from active practice into the digital health world. So was there a particular moment or kind of what drove you to make that transition from practice to supporting digital health?
Sure. I think that I actually attribute that transition partly to what I jokingly call probably like a mid-career crisis, although I think many physicians will say 10 years into practice, that's not mid-career, right? That's relatively early on. And then maybe by accident as well. And so I will say that at that time, I had completed the first decade of my career in medicine. I was looking forward to the next decade and asking myself, where do I see myself 10 years from now? Where do I see the practice of oncology 10 years from now? And it was very clear to me that day-to-day, clinical care was probably not something I wanted to do 10 years down the road. And that was driven primarily by understanding that we're becoming aware of this larger ecosystem outside of medical care, right, of medical practice, that many policies, many technologies are coming into play, right, trying to help doctors either become, better decision makers, and taking better care of the patients. And so looking at that and also looking at the exploding world of therapeutics, especially when it comes to cancer care, was the fact that, I wanted to participate in a larger discussion, right, a greater discussion. And that was coupled by a desire to make a bigger impact on patients' lives outside of the four walls of my clinic. And at the same time, also feeling that I have reached that point in my career maturity where I felt I have amassed enough practical wisdom, so to speak, that I could impart that to either the newer generation of clinicians or hopefully bring that to the table when it comes to conversations about how do we improve healthcare, right? Because I had the on-the-ground experience. So all of that combined, right? And it was a lot of soul searching, so to speak. Wondering, and there were thoughts that crossed my mind of wondering whether or not, I was crazy, right? All my predecessors, all my mentors have spent, they went into medicine, they went into one specialty and practiced that specialty until they retired. And so it was a really, really difficult decision to make, Matt. And at the same time, IBM Watson Health reached out to me looking for oncologists. And that was by accident, I guess. Maybe it wasn't an accident, but it came to me, that opportunity came to me at the right time. And after many, many months of soul searching and conversations with many different folks, I made the decision to take a leap of faith and leave medical practice altogether.
Yeah, and it sounds like you got kind of an interesting opportunity to go to, as you said, starting at Watson Health. So, kind of thinking about the development process, going from, a place that was grabbing headlines left and right and, really selling this one particular vision of the future, kind of how have you seen the process of digital health creation or process of digital health development change as you've gone from Watson now to COTA and, start and have seen maybe some lessons learned throughout those experiences?
Sure. No, Matt, I will say that the appeal of Watson Health at that time, or a technology such as Watson, for oncology, Watson for genomics, what IBM was trying to develop, right, was quite appealing to me at that time. I think I had, stated the fact that one of my decisions, or one of the driving factors of me leaving practice was this rapid explosion of oncology therapeutics, right? Keep in mind that with that rapid explosion comes a lot of uncertainty on how to best treat a patient, how to best sequence a patient throughout therapy. And my perspective was the fact that I, at least for myself at that time, was the fact that I don't know how an oncologist 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road could ever keep up with all these therapies, that they must need something to help them, right? Especially an oncologist that sees multiple different cancers. I understand if you focus and specialize in one cancer, one could become a true expert in that disease. But most oncologists in this country, if not in the world, see multiple different cancers at one time. So the promise of a novel technology, in this case AI, to assist with the decision making and to assist with patient care was quite appealing. And going to IBM, I joined IBM in the earlier days of Watson Health, and I was one of the earlier oncologists that joined Watson Health. And so I was very fortunate enough to learn a little bit about all aspects of the business, even the technology itself, right? And I tell folks that I probably know more about AI and machine learning than any oncologist should ever know. But I just know enough to make myself dangerous, right? But in looking through kind of my experience there and my experience here at COTA, I think that I will say, and just also just knowing what has happened in clinical practice, right, in medical research over the last 4 to 5 years, is the fact that the pace of medical innovation and drug and therapeutic development has not slowed down, and I don't see it slowing down in the near future. As long as this disease remains one of the top killers, right, here in the States. And I believe it's the top killer around the world for most adults. And so I don't see that slowing down. And I see this rapidly, this continuously, rapidly expanding knowledge base that's out there that we all need to make sense of. And so during my time outside of the clinical world, I see that healthcare innovation, health technology innovation is not going to slow down. But where I come from here now, from the COTA perspective, is a lot of the technology, these newer forms of technology that are based upon, machine learning algorithms or AI, is that they need to be trained on good data, right? And that's what brought me to COTA. And I have seen this focus on data over the last 2 to 3 years since I've been here at COTA. And also understanding that despite all the data that we have out there to help us take care of patients, which historically has been coming from more the clinical trial world, is the fact that there's a whole new data set out there, which is the real world clinical data that is just sitting there, not being used today, or not being used very much today, that I predict and I see that there will be a continued focus and use of all of this real world clinical data that we've been essentially, that's been growing over the last decade or so.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the recognition that good data are necessary for that training and development of AI and ML tools. So how do you define good data?
I think good data needs to be representative, number one, right, of the population which it serves. Number two, it needs to be as accurate as possible. But we know that accuracy, where 100% accuracy can be a moving target in any industry, right? Short of that, it needs to be consistent, meaning that, a consistent method by which that data, is abstracted or curated or comes about, needs to, it needs to be there that to ensure that all data was accessed in a consistent manner. So that if there's an error that was detected, right, we can easily go back and correct, that error across all data sets. So I think that I think of all those different elements, I think representation of the population that it is proposed to be serving, I think that's probably in my mind right now one of the most important.
Yeah, no, and I think you're definitely right, because that's, I think, getting long overdue attention, especially as there's understanding growing that some of the traditional models or predictive tools that have been developed did not rely upon that representative data and create kind of inappropriate predictions or driving less than ideal care for patients from different populations.
That's right.
For those of you just joining, I'm talking with Dr. CK Wang of COTA, and we've been talking about kind of growth of AI and ML tools and development of technology within healthcare. And CK, you've been mentioning oncology a lot. And what I'd like to do is actually first, before diving into that, ask you to just make sure that we're all level set in understanding exactly what is covered by oncology.
Sure. Oncology is essentially the field of cancer care, right? And it does technically can encompass many different specialties, whether it's a surgical oncology or a surgical oncologist, radiation oncologist, or medical oncologist, which is who I am. And then there are a lot of other healthcare specialties that touch a cancer patient, but are not specifically trained to care for the cancer patient. So when I talk about oncology, I am referring more specifically to those who are delivering care to those patients, so mostly the radiation, the medical, and the surgical oncologist.
And you've been talking a lot about, with your career path and your current focus at COTA being on, you using data and technology to help refine the delivery of oncology care. Before getting into that and seeing how change is happening, what was the traditional oncology care pathway or course of treatment like for both the clinical team and for the patients?
Sure. No, that's an excellent question, Matt. Ever since I have been in medical training, gosh, this was in the early 2000s, right? It was ingrained to me that medicine has to be evidence-based, right? We practice evidence-based medicine. That evidence historically has come about from clinical trials. Over the last, I would say 10 to 20 years during that time period, especially in oncology, where therapy is much more prescribed, so to speak, and probably also due to the continuously rising costs of oncology therapeutics, was that many standardized pathways have been published, right, out there in the greater ecosystem to help guide appropriate therapies for specific cancers. So historically speaking, our practice and care of our practice of oncology and care of a cancer patient were based upon these standardized guidelines as well as clinical trial findings and therapeutic approvals as a result of those clinical trial findings. I will say, though, that despite that, is that a lot of patients do not fit into that classic clinical trial population. And over the last few years, I think we've been talking, there's been a lot more dialogue about that, right? Out of COVID, right? About how different populations of patients are just not well represented in clinical trials. This is something that is pervasive throughout the entire medical ecosystem. It's not just COVID related. This is oncology. We like to say that cancer research and clinical trial participation in oncology and cancer care has not changed at all over the last few decades, right? Depending on which survey you look at, only 3 to 5%, maybe 6% of all cancer patients ever participate on a clinical trial. And those patients are predominantly white. Historically, they've been more male, although the male to female ratio is changing. I think we're close to 50-50 now. They historically have been younger patients, whereas cancer happens to typically older patients. And they typically comprise of patients who have access to healthcare, right? And so you can tell very quickly that with that general description, right, of these clinical trial participants, is that many cancer patients who show up in my clinic in front of me, who are sitting in front of me for treatment planning, do not fit that picture of that clinical trial participant. So the question always is, well, then what is the best thing to do? Well, we extrapolate, right? We assume that because the clinical trials showed this result and this therapy was FDA approved, therefore it must be effective for this patient sitting in front of me. And so that is, for a patient that fits that specific disease that the clinical trial was studying. And on the other hand, there are those patients with these rare diseases or these rare scenarios that have never been studied in clinical trials, right? What do you do at that time? Well, we typically reach out to experts, and there is, I guess, there is a joke in the oncology world that when it comes to rare condition, right? If you see 2 cases, you are an expert because they're extremely rare. And so, historically speaking, I would reach out to colleagues that I know are specialists who are, nationally well known in that disease. I'll reach out to them for advice on how to take care of a patient. So historically speaking, that was how we as a field and how I practiced back then.
So given that historical context, with your current work, how are you seeing that pathway begin to change and evolve with newer tools and hopefully kind of more in-depth understanding growing, what sounds like probably on a daily basis?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think what's promising, right? And maybe like backtracking a little bit here, so that we're all on the same page. I think if everyone recalls the High-Tech Act, right, that was passed in like 2009, that ushered in, what we know today as all the medical record record systems are in place, right? That moved us away from paper records. Was that one of the promises or one of the potential promise that the high tech ad highlighted, right? And they actually called this out in the plan was to have a meaningful use of the EHRs, right? Meaningful use meaning we can actually learn from all that information, and I will say until recently that has not been realized. And what we are hopeful for and excited about here at COTA is the fact that many companies such as COTA, we're in the real world data space, is the fact that we're making all of that data meaningful and usable by many different stakeholders. So hopefully in the near future is that not only can we, resort to the traditional ways, or I guess, sources of data, right? The clinical trial findings, the pathways are out there, but also to learn from all of that data that's been residing in the clinical world, right, in the clinical record systems, and learn from that, and hopefully identify patients that are similar to those that are sitting in front of you, right, as a doctor, similar to the patient sitting in front of you, so that you can make the best decision, that you're not just resorting to your gut feeling or extrapolation, which many times I think many of us will say that it's very prone and subject to bias, actually.
So as you're talking about kind of extracting a lot of that clinical data that's in the AHR, what are some of the challenges of being able to get it out and then being able to kind of get to your definition of good data, or how you describe good data to be?
Sure. No, I think the most important and probably the most fundamental problem is access to that data, right? I think many providers, and as they should be, are very protective of their patient data. But even after you have access to the data, I think the structure by which the data is residing in can be quite difficult and make it difficult to access. And I think that, as you are probably very well versed in this, is the fact that most of the data we have out there reside in the unstructured format, right? In text, in free-flowing text. And that is the case when it comes to clinical documentation as well. And to make sense or to extract meaningful information of the unstructured data is quite a complex task, and could be very difficult as well because of the inconsistency in some of that clinical documentation. I like to say that the data that we pull out is only as good as the documentation itself. So if it's not documented, there's no way of pulling that out, right? If there are two pieces of conflicting information, that makes it difficult. But that's where we here at COTA, we have medical expertise to actually go back into the clinical documentation and really try to, sort out what is the correct set of data, so to speak, right? So that it can be as accurate as possible. And I think the other complexity that lies in making sense of this data is the fact that is making sure that the process you have to extract that data has a sense of consistency to it too. So I think all of those are just different layers that make it very difficult. But I will say that the one thing that in my mind, I always think about kind of what is a low-hanging fruit, right, when we want to solve this problem. And I would say that probably the most straightforward, I would say probably the most basic, I think, issue that we need to address or could address would be the accuracy of the data that is being entered to begin with. And because that really makes the subsequent tasks much, much simpler going forward.
And if you could have a simple way to begin to address that, what are some of the ways to be able to improve that accuracy? And maybe part of the way to answer that is also to ask, what are some of the barriers to having the accuracy in the first place?
Sure. I think a lot of the barriers boil down to time, right? And I think we all hear and read about, how much pressure all physicians are currently under, right? Time-wise. And this is not a new problem. And it's because I will say that for those of you, who are, coming into our podcast, if you've ever been in doctor's office, you're probably not, foreign to the long waits in the waiting room. And I will say the long waits is just because of the fact that the doctor schedules are packed, right? So it's not a new problem, but I think that with what has happened over the last 2 years with COVID, with folks moving out of the healthcare industry, right, or leaving, which is, has always been happening, but I think has become a bigger issue over the last 2 years, is that time constraint, is becoming very, very challenging. And so without time to fully document, to make sure that the information going in is correct, so you can see that error can exist, and it could be, it could carry on that, from one provider to the next provider who's reading that same documentation, right? Don't want to make myself, hated by my colleagues, but I will say that one of the easiest ways to tackle, data entry, right, to make sure that we have, or a practitioner is entering all the relevant data in the most accurate manner, is to make sure that we build in structured fields, right, into the medical record system to essentially guide the clinician through what are the critical data elements are needed for the care of this patient with this specific disease. It's a completely different way of thinking about data entry, right? It's no longer unstructured, so to speak, right? It's highlighting all the critical data elements and then allowing for, the unstructured data following that. So I think that would be probably one of the first steps that we can all take.
And I think those are very interesting points. As you said, the time crunch, which I think is getting better recognition. And I think, as you were suggesting, physicians have known for a very long time about that issue, but then trying to come up with ways to maximize the efficiency would certainly be very helpful. And I think it's also, unfortunately going to have to be the final takeaway point, because believe it or not, we're already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Dr. CK Wang, for a great conversation today.
Thank you so much, Matt, for having me.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.